Hi guys, welcome to our lesson on the autonomic nervous system. This first video will focus a little bit on some introductory remarks and some anatomical factors and some general functional principles that we can take and carry on into some specific examples that we'll get into later on in the lesson of how the autonomic nervous system works. I'll start by saying it is really important that you understand how this system works because it's going to come up over and over and over again as we work our way through the organ systems of the body. It is one of the, if not the, primary control mechanism for many of the organs, and it's a major coordinating system. And it's one that you can take advantage of pharmacologically as well. So we're going to be talking a lot about it as we move along through the curriculum. And so the reason why it's introduced here is because it has a lot to do with control of the cardiovascular system, as you will find out quite soon in this block. And because this is the first real organ system block that you've got, and so introducing it now is a very, very good idea. And the same was true of the smooth muscle lesson that I gave you previous to this. Smooth muscle is something you're going to be running into a lot. And so it was worth throwing in a lesson with some general characteristics before we got into the specifics of vascular smooth muscle. So having said that, let's go ahead and get started with this. First of all, the autonomic nervous system is an efferent nervous system, and it is to be distinguished from the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system, typically, you're working through motor neurons to do something like move skeletal muscle. With the autonomic nervous system, this is going to be a system that is, for the most part, subconscious. It just works automatically. You don't think about it at all. And it's going to control smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, the glands, a lot of involuntary responses, okay? This helps to control a lot of the responses throughout the body. Arterial pressure in the cardiovascular system, gastrointestinal motility and secretion, urinary bladder emptying, sweating, control of body temperature, a lot of the things that are involved, a lot in the homeostasis of your body, that is keeping things kind of constant throughout the body. And the cardiovascular system is once again an excellent example of that. Generally speaking, what happens is some signal is transferred to centers in the spinal cord and the brainstem and the hypothalamus, and these generally control the response by sending out an output signal to your autonomic nervous system. It is worth noting that higher centers can be involved here, and they're critical for emotional expressions like blushing, things like that. We aren't going to talk a lot about this. We're going to talk a lot about some of the other functions, however. And it's worth pointing this out. They'll probably talk about this a lot more in your brain and behavior block, which will be coming all too soon. So two main basic functions, basic metabolic and vegetative functions, basically running the organ systems of the body, energy storage and release, control of endocrine and neuroendocrine release, things like that. We are not going to talk a lot about its role in behavior. Again, we'll leave that to the behavioral guys in brain and behavior. Rather than address that here, we are going to talk entirely about number one. Okay? A few general principles before we move on. First of all organs innervated by the parasympathetic nervous system are also innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. The opposite is not always true. There are some organs that only receives sympathetic innervation, and the prime example of that is vascular smooth muscle. It is true for the most part in vascular smooth muscle, with rare exceptions. The sympathetic system is associated with emergency conditions. So basically, when you think of the classical fight or flight response, which I'm sure all of you guys have heard of before, that is your sympathetic nervous system at work. Getting you ready to run away from a bear, things like that. Should you be attacked by one, which I would not wish on you. The parasympathetic nervous system is associated with local protective functions. It's very finely tuned. The classic example is the iris, which will constrict in response to increased light to protect your retinas. Really more of a local protective function as much as anything else. At rest, the parasympathetic nervous system is more active. And what tells you this is the action of your nervous system upon the heart and upon heart rate. Resting heart rate is about 60. If you take all the nerves to the heart and you cut them, the spontaneous heart rate with no autonomic nervous system inputs at all is about 100. So that tells you at rest, your autonomic nervous system is more active. It has a higher tone. Your parasympathetic nervous system has a higher tone because your heart rate is less than it would be without any autonomic nervous system input at all. So the parasympathetic nervous system is more active at rest. Okay. The two systems tend to have reciprocal effects, and they tend to be synergistic. So once again, the action on the heart is really classic. You have parasympathetic inputs that lower heart rate. You have sympathetic inputs that raise heart rate. And there is always tone. That is, they're always output from both. It's never one is on, one is off. It's always output from both into whatever target you're talking about. And if you want to raise your heart rate, what you'll do is you'll decrease parasympathetic activity. That will tend to raise your heart rate. At the same time, you'll decrease parasympathetic tone. At the same time, you will increase sympathetic tone. And that will also tend to raise your heart rate. So both will work together to cause your heart rate to go up. The increased sympathetic tone has a role in that. The decreased parasympathetic tone has a role in that. So the effects are synergistic. Okay? And again, the ANS is always working. You don't shut it off. We're talking about volume controls. You turn the volume down on the parasympathetic side. You turn the volume up on the sympathetic side, and that increases your heart rate. But you never hit a volume of 0 on either side, not physiologically. Okay? The ANS organizes the outputs of individual tissues and organs to produce a response. It is the coordinator. So if I'm eating a meal, my parasympathetic tone goes up, I turn up the volume button. That causes me to secrete more from my secretory organs like my salivary glands. It causes an increase in the motility in my GI tract and in my stomach. I'll get more secretions. All of these things are coordinated to produce one, or to help with one particular function, that is digestion. So the autonomic nervous system, that's the way it works. It coordinates between tissues and organs to produce a response that is consistent with what your body needs. Okay? All right, so your autonomic nervous system works through reflex responses, okay? And the reason it does that is because it is generally not a voluntary response. That is, you need a way to respond that is not conscious, and you do that through the classic reflex response. It's similar but not identical to what you see in the somatic nervous system, where you're talking about a reflex where you touch something hot and you pull your hand away. You do that without thinking, oh my gosh, that's hot, I have to move my hand and now I'm going to move it. It happens automatically, okay? It happens without conscious control. So the autonomic nervous system works the same, in very much the same way. there is an input, the pot is hot, or there is an input, my blood pressure went up, and then there is a response. I yank my arm back, there is a response. I decrease my cardiac output to bring that blood pressure back to normal or to move my hand away from the heat. Both happen without conscious control. Okay, so how does this work? You start with some sort of a receptor. For the autonomic nervous system, it could be a mechanical or chemoreceptor. In the case of your classic withdrawal reflex, which is a somatic reflex, it's a pain receptor in your finger if you touch something hot. That receptor results in the generation of a series of action potentials which go through an afferent pathway, okay, that is incoming. That pathway synapses with the spinal cord. In the case of the autonomic nervous system, you will generally send a signal to higher centers in the brain, which will automatically, without conscious thought, send signals back down in order to evoke a response. In the case of the withdrawal reflex, it pretty much all happens locally within the spinal cord, where your signal is transferred through synapses to ultimately to motor neurons, and these form your efferent pathway for the somatic nervous system. And we have an efferent pathway here as your signal comes down from your medulla, your brainstem, and which basically says, hey, do something. And then that signal comes out of the spinal cord in the same way you have efferent pathways here, you have an efferent pathway here. And then you have an effector organ, which is the target. In this case, it is the muscles in your arm, which automatically pull back away from the hot pot here. In this case, it will generally be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, something like that that will evoke a response. Okay, so very similar between the two, not exactly identical, but generally speaking, they follow the same sort of a scheme. Okay. In the case of the autonomic nervous system, you're talking about a generally restorative response. That is, and again, the classic one is the mean arterial pressure. Mean arterial pressure drops, the autonomic nervous system kicks in, you get a restorative response to bring the mean arterial pressure back up toward normal. Because this is something that your body wants to keep constant, the mean arterial pressure. Okay? I am not going to cover the anatomy extensively. I am going to leave that to the experts, which are the anatomists. I just want to briefly cover a few things that I think are important points physiologically. First of all, the preganglionic fibers, which exit the spinal cord, are short on the sympathetic side, and they terminate in ganglia, where they release acetylcholine. Okay. And acetylcholine binds to, in the ganglia, nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. These are not the same as the muscarinic receptors, which we introduced in some of the introductory lectures on the heart. These are different acetylcholine receptors. Okay, they're nicotinic receptors, but ACH still the neurotransmitter in the ganglia. Okay. The ACH is bound to nicotinic receptors. This generates a signal, and you get action potentials now in the postganglionic fibers. These are generally fairly long, and they run to your target, and they secrete norepinephrine at the target, which evokes a response. Some, rare ones, do secrete ACH. This is called sympathetic cholinergic activation, okay? And it happens in sweat glands, misspelled here, sweat glands, and some blood vessels, okay, where you get sympathetic fibers that secrete ACH. So we call this sympathetic cholinergic activation. Sympathetic nervous system, cholinergic meaning acetylcholine activation. Some blood vessels respond to ACH as well. We will talk about both of these examples later on in the lesson. Okay. Very briefly, Instead of directly passing out of the sympathetic, out as a sympathetic nerve to an effector, some postganglionic neurons do pass to the gray rami, and then up and down, where they will really extend to all parts of the body. So, you know, blood vessels, sweat glands, piloerector muscles, things like that. These are your gray rami, and that is about all I'm going to say on that. I'm going to leave that to the anatomist. But you get a more diffuse response as the neurons travel through the gray rami. Or more diffuse in that it'll travel farther away from the spinal cord. All right, enough said about that. Parasympathetic nervous system. Generally, we're talking about cranial nerves, or we're talking about sacral nerves. The most important cranial nerve is the 10th, which is the vagus. It goes to the heart, for instance, the GI tract, all of these organs. So it is fairly important, and I'm sure the anatomist will talk about it at great length in terms of where it runs and how. The preganglionic fibers in the parasympathetic nervous system are long. They generally terminate in ganglia that are close to the effector organ. Again, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, and again, the receptor on the postganglionic neuron is the nicotinic ACH receptor. Okay, so in that respect, it's the same as the sympathetic. And then the acetylcholine is secreted by the postganglionic fiber onto the target organ, always on the parasympathetic side, okay? And that evokes the response. So, in summary, we have parasympathetic response, where we have our preganglionic nerves. And then they tend to be long. They secrete acetylcholine onto your postganglionic nerves in the ganglia, and the receptor here is the nicotinic ACH receptor. And then in the end, you secrete acetylcholine here onto your target organs. On the sympathetic side, classically, we have shorter preganglionic fibers. Again, they secrete acetylcholine. The acetylcholine binds to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, just like it did for the sympathetics, and then that evokes action potentials in the postganglionic fiber, which secretes norepinephrine. This one tending to be longer than on the parasympathetic side. We get norepinephrine released. Okay. Classically, norepinephrine. Now, having said that, also part of the sympathetic response is epinephrine secretion by the adrenal medulla. So we have our preganglionic fiber secreting ACH, just like we do over here. The ACH binds to the nicotinic receptors, just like it did over here. But in this case, instead of a postganglionic fiber secreting norepinephrine, we have the adrenal medulla, which binds that ACH, and it secretes epinephrine in response. So I think of the adrenal medulla as being sort of like, functionally, one big postganglionic fiber that secretes epinephrine instead of norepinephrine, and it secretes it into the bloodstream, where it finds its targets via the blood. All right? And then finally, we have those rare exceptions which secrete ACH instead of norepinephrine, sympathetic cholinergic activation, sweat glands, some blood vessels. Okay? All right. That is all I've got for this first video. Thank you for your attention, and I'll start with the next video when you're ready.